When you compare $997 billion to $149 billion, the difference seems obvious. One looks like a mountain, the other a hill. But if you stop at the numbers, you miss the real story, because real power isn't just about spending more. It's about investing smarter. It's about having the infrastructure, the partnerships, the innovation pipeline, and the economic stability to turn dollars into decisions that shape the future. And right now, we're watching two countries, the United States and Russia, exist on completely different planes of influence, yet still collide on the world stage. So let's unpack this mismatch, not with propaganda, not with emotion, but with insight. When we talk about defense budget, especially numbers as large as $997 billion and $149 billion, it's easy to assume the outcome is predetermined. One figure towers over the other, and the natural instinct is to equate dollars with dominance. But that assumption overlooks the nuances of how power is structured, maintained, and projected. The truth is, scale isn't just about size, it's about complexity, integration, and adaptability. What you do with your resources often matters more than how much of them you have. The U.S. defense budget reflects a system that is deeply layered and interconnected. It supports not only the immediate tools of warfare, but the entire framework that sustains technological evolution, strategic flexibility, and long-term global presence. That budget includes investments in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, satellite communications, and space-based surveillance. These aren't just futuristic buzzwords. They are the scaffolding for the next generation of defense capabilities. And more importantly, they feed back into civilian innovation. The same GPS satellites that help locate a target in a remote region also help civilians navigate a city. The line between military and civilian tech has blurred, and in a high-functioning ecosystem, that's a strategic advantage. Meanwhile, Russia operates on a fundamentally different model. With far fewer resources, the focus tends to narrow. Instead of sustaining global influence through a web of alliances, Russia prioritizes regional dominance and strategic disruption. Their defense spending is more concentrated on short-term effectiveness, things like artillery, tanks, and missile systems that can impose immediate costs on an adversary. It's a model that relies on making small punches hurt more than they should, but it lacks the depth and scalability to support a truly modern, adaptive military infrastructure. When your toolkit is based on past conflicts, your reach becomes limited, and your impact becomes episodic rather than enduring. That's the essence of asymmetry. It's not just an imbalance of money, it's an imbalance of structure. The U.S. military is supported by an architecture of public-private partnerships, academic research institutions, and global supply chains. It's designed not just to respond to threats, but to anticipate them. That requires enormous amounts of data, simulation, and predictive modeling. These capabilities don't come cheap, and they don't emerge overnight. They are the result of years, decades, of consistent investment and strategic patience. When you're operating at scale, mistakes can't be easily reversed. So the margin for error is thinner, and the standards for foresight are much higher. In contrast, Russia's model is more reactive. It operates with fewer checks and balances, and its power projection tends to be immediate but unsustainable. Think of it like the difference between building a data center versus renting one. One gives you control, scalability, and security. The other gives you access, briefly. That doesn't mean Russia can't inflict damage. It absolutely can and has, but the model it uses is not built to last. It's built to be seen. Another aspect of this asymmetry is mobility. The U.S. can deploy military assets anywhere in the world within hours. Aircraft carriers, forward operating bases, and logistics networks enable a type of global responsiveness that few nations can replicate. That's a function of both budget and planning. It's one thing to have equipment. It's another to be able to get it to the right place at the right time with the right support. That's what scale enables, not just a show of force, but the ability to maintain it, relocate it, and evolve it based on shifting global dynamics. And there's also a psychological dimension. Nations don't just observe what the U.S. has, they calibrate their own decisions around it. That kind of gravitational pull doesn't come from a single budget cycle. It comes from decades of being perceived as the default anchor of global stability, especially among allies. Russia doesn't have that effect. Its power doesn't ripple outward in the same way. It may cause tension, but it doesn't create strategic coherence. That's what a mismatch of might really means. Not just that one side is bigger, but that one side is built for the future, and the other is barely keeping pace with the present. So when we say the U.S. spends almost $1 trillion on defense, the instinct might be to question the scale. But in truth, that scale enables a kind of resilience and reach that goes beyond any single battlefield. It supports the platforms that keep satellites operational, that defend digital infrastructure, and that secure the foundations of modern civilization. In today's world, that's what might looks like. It's not just about having more, it's about being more, smarter, faster, and prepared for what's next. When we look at how nations build their defense capabilities, the difference between innovation and imitation becomes one of the most revealing indicators of long-term strength. It's not just about who has more weapons or more troops. It's about who is building the systems that will define warfare 5, 10, or even 20 years from now. Innovation is not just a buzzword, it's a strategic multiplier. It turns limited resources into exponential force. And in this area, the divide between the United States and Russia is both wide and consequential. The United States treats innovation as a foundational element of national security. Defense spending is not simply aimed at acquiring existing tools, but at developing entirely new ones. There are dedicated ecosystems, government agencies, defense contractors, research universities, and startups, all working together to solve problems that haven't even materialized yet. From autonomous drones that can think in real time to cybersecurity systems powered by machine learning, this is a structure built not just to respond to threats, but to stay several steps ahead of them. That kind of innovation doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning, investment, and most importantly, the freedom to fail and iterate. In a complex technological environment, not every idea will work the first time or even the 10th. But when a system encourages experimentation and rewards learning from failure, it starts to unlock breakthroughs. In the U.S. model, military research often feeds directly into civilian technology and vice versa. The same artificial intelligence driving predictive maintenance on fighter jets might also be improving medical diagnostics or self-driving cars. This cross-pollination creates a loop where advances in one area benefit others, accelerating overall progress. Russia, on the other hand, operates differently. While it does engage in technological development, its approach often leans toward imitation rather than original innovation. Much of its recent military modernization has involved upgrades to existing Soviet-era platforms rather than a full leap into future-ready technologies. When hypersonic missiles or new aircraft are introduced, they are often showcased as symbols of strength. But the underlying ecosystem needed to sustain and evolve these technologies is not as robust. Without strong private sector integration or a reliable innovation pipeline, these tools can become isolated achievements rather than stepping stones. One of the challenges of imitation is that it always leaves you a step behind. Even if a country engineers a new missile system or mimics the layout of a modern command and control interface, it still lacks the deep understanding and infrastructure to improve upon it or scale it effectively. Imitation might provide short-term gains, enough to make headlines or gain regional leverage, but it rarely translates into enduring capability. There's also a fundamental difference in how both nations view the role of data. In the U.S., data is treated as a strategic asset. Massive defense budgets fund data collection, analysis, and integration at every level, from satellites monitoring global movements to algorithms analyzing digital chatter across continents. That data is then used to inform decision making in real time, offering strategic clarity that's hard to match. Russia, by comparison, often operates in more opaque environments, where control takes precedence over openness, and where the ability to analyze data at scale is more constrained by structural limitations. Innovation is also about people. In the U.S., there's a deliberate effort to attract top talent, not just soldiers, but scientists, engineers, and coders. The brightest minds from the best universities are pulled into defense projects because they're incentivized to contribute to national goals while also advancing their personal research and careers. That flow of talent is one of the biggest long-term advantages any country can have. Russia faces a more difficult road here, as brain drain and institutional constraints limit its capacity to retain and empower high-level innovators in a consistent way. Then there's the speed of adaptation. The U.S. military isn't perfect. It's a large system, and large systems can be slow. But when compared to others, it still has a remarkable ability to adapt, often driven by feedback loops from real-world missions and simulations. Technologies go from prototype to battlefield faster when there's a tight loop between design, deployment, and iteration. That's how innovation becomes embedded into the system. It stops being a separate function and becomes part of how decisions are made, how operations are run, and how outcomes are improved. Ultimately, the gap between innovation and imitation isn't just academic, it's strategic. In today's global environment, where conflicts are hybrid and threats are dynamic, the ability to innovate determines not just who wins battles, but who defines the rules. And when one nation is building the future while the other is trying to replicate the present, the advantage becomes less about what you see today and more about what will be possible tomorrow. That's the true measure of might. Power doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's sustained, scaled, and tested by the economic systems that support it. A military, no matter how large or advanced, can't operate without a healthy, adaptive economy behind it. The ability to project power over time, to build, maintain, and evolve complex systems, depends on more than just political will or historical precedent. It depends on economic fundamentals that are resilient, diversified, and future-oriented. This is where we see a sharp contrast in how the United States and Russia maintain their global positions, and why one is structured for long-term sustainability while the other faces deeper structural constraints. The United States operates from a position of immense economic breadth. It's not just about having the world's largest GDP, though that does matter. It's about the composition of that economy. It's powered by a rich mix of technology, finance, healthcare, education, energy, and consumer markets. This diversity acts like a stabilizer, allowing the country to absorb shocks without losing momentum. When one sector slows down, another often steps up. That kind of balance allows for consistent investment in defense, infrastructure, and innovation, even during times of crisis. And because so much of the U.S. economy is tied to high-growth, knowledge-driven industries, its capacity to fund long-term strategic goals remains strong. Defense spending in the U.S. doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a broader loop in which innovation, capital, and research all feed into one another. Private companies drive a large share of technological advancement. Universities perform critical foundational research. Venture capital flows into defense tech startups that build next-generation solutions. This creates a dynamic where the economy isn't just funding defense, it's transforming it. The economic engine is continuously producing new tools, new data, and new ways of solving problems. That's not just economic power, that's structural leverage. In contrast, Russia's economy is far more concentrated. A significant portion of its national revenue is derived from oil, gas, and raw materials. While those resources can generate large sums of money, especially during periods of high demand, they are vulnerable to external shocks. When prices fall or sanctions hit, the government's fiscal room to maneuver shrinks dramatically. It becomes harder to sustain ambitious programs, especially those that require consistent, long-term funding like defense modernization or scientific research. An economy that depends so heavily on extraction rather than creation faces limitations that go beyond dollars. It's about adaptability. In a world that's rapidly digitizing and decarbonizing, the nations that dominate will be those that invent the tools of tomorrow, not those holding onto the resources of yesterday. Russia's industrial base is aging, and while it maintains significant capabilities in certain sectors, it struggles to compete at scale in high-tech fields. That limits not just economic growth, but the range of strategic options available when geopolitical tension rises. There's also the matter of integration. The U.S. economy is deeply woven into global systems through supply chains, capital markets, alliances, and regulatory bodies. This brings complexity, but also influence. When you sit at the center of the global financial and technological network, your decisions reverberate. Your ability to apply economic pressure, offer investment, or shift supply dynamics becomes a strategic tool. Sanctions, for example, only carry real weight if the sanctioning country holds the levers of global commerce. And in many ways, the U.S. does. Russia, on the other hand, often finds itself isolated economically, especially in times of conflict or international backlash. When capital exits, when trade routes tighten, or when companies pull out, the internal strain grows. That makes it harder to import advanced components, to access new technologies, or to fund expansive programs without running into structural bottlenecks. This doesn't mean Russia lacks resilience. It has adapted under pressure many times, but the cost of those adaptations is rising. And when you're forced to redirect economic resources toward maintaining political control or plugging financial leaks, it becomes harder to invest in long-term strength. Another critical dimension is trust. Investors, partners, and allies are more likely to engage with economies that are transparent, governed by rule of law, and open to innovation. The U.S., despite its own challenges, still ranks high in all of these areas. It remains a magnet for global talent, capital, and entrepreneurship. That creates a feedback loop where success attracts more resources, and more resources fuel further progress. That kind of trust cannot be commanded. It has to be earned over time through stability, credibility, and vision. When comparing power, it's tempting to focus on visible displays, military assets, international headlines, or diplomatic summits. But beneath all of that is the machinery that makes sustained influence possible. The United States, through the strength of its economic foundations, has the ability not just to defend its interests, but to redefine what's possible. That's the difference. not just how much you can do today, but how reliably you can adapt, scale, and lead into tomorrow. Maintaining a global presence isn't just a matter of policy, it's a matter of investment. The ability to reach across continents, operate in multiple time zones simultaneously, and respond to complex challenges anywhere on Earth requires an enormous logistical and financial commitment. It's not glamorous. Much of it is behind the scenes, fueling aircraft carriers, maintaining satellite networks, training personnel for environments as different as the Arctic and the Sahara. But the scale of it matters because it defines the limits of what a nation can project, not just in military terms, but in diplomatic, economic, and technological influence. The United States has built a system that's capable of this kind of reach. But it comes at a cost. That $997 billion defense budget isn't just buying weapons. It's underwriting an infrastructure that spans the planet, dozens of bases in strategic locations, fleets that move autonomously for months, intelligence networks that operate 24/7 across every imaginable terrain and domain. Maintaining this level of readiness is like running a massive operating system that never powers down. The fuel, alone literal and metaphorical, is staggering. But the result is a level of responsiveness and presence that no other nation can match. This capability didn't appear overnight. It's the product of decades of planning, alliances, and constant iteration. The U.S. doesn't just deploy assets globally, it sustains them. It rotates personnel, rotates equipment, upgrades systems while they're still in the field, and ensures every moving part connects back to a larger strategic architecture. This is what enables the U.S. to participate in humanitarian missions one day, enforce sanctions the next, and deter aggression the day after. That flexibility is priceless, but it's also incredibly expensive. Now compare that to a country like Russia, whose defense spending is a fraction of the size. Their approach is fundamentally different, not necessarily by choice, but by necessity. Rather than trying to sustain a global footprint, the strategy centers around regional influence, asymmetric tactics, and selective disruption. It's about doing more with less, but also accepting that reach has limits. Instead of building alliances across oceans, Russia concentrates on maintaining leverage in its near abroad. Instead of long-range power projection, it leans on missile systems, cyber operations, and rapid mobilization forces within proximity to its borders. There's a certain efficiency to that, but it comes with trade-offs. When a nation limits its reach, it also limits its options. It becomes harder to shape global outcomes or protect interests far from home. And while this narrower focus can appear cost-effective in the short term, it also means reduced influence over the international rules, norms, and frameworks that ultimately define security and prosperity. Global reach isn't just about geography, it's also about partnerships. The U.S. maintains formal alliances with dozens of countries. It co-develops technology with allies, trains forces alongside them, and shares intelligence across continents. These relationships are force multipliers. They extend the value of every dollar spent because they're built on mutual interest and interoperability. When a crisis emerges, the U.S. doesn't act alone, it coordinates. That collaboration spreads the cost, but also strengthens the system. But building that kind of network takes time and credibility. Trust isn't automatic. It's earned through consistency and shared values. Nations choose to align with those they believe will show up every time, not just when convenient. That kind of reliability isn't cheap, but it's a form of power that endures beyond the battlefield. Russia, on the other hand, operates with a more transactional mindset when it comes to alliances. Its influence often relies on coercion or short-term dependencies, whether economic or political. That may be enough to hold influence over certain states, but it doesn't create the kind of durable, high-trust systems that lead to long-term strategic depth. Without a web of trusted partners, reach becomes reactive rather than proactive. There's also the cost of perception. A country with global reach is constantly under the microscope. Its actions are scrutinized, its motives questioned, its presence felt in ways both welcome and controversial. That visibility requires a level of strategic clarity and discipline that goes beyond technical superiority. It means thinking about the second and third order effects of every move. Global presence isn't just about where you are, it's about how you're perceived when you get there. The economic cost is immense, but the strategic payoff, if managed wisely, is unmatched. It allows a country not just to protect its interests, but to shape the future, to influence the trajectory of global development, steer the direction of emerging technologies, and respond when others cannot. That's what global reach makes possible, and that's why it costs so much, because true reach isn't just about being everywhere, it's about being relevant, trusted, and capable wherever you are. In any discussion about power, especially military or geopolitical power, there's always a tension between how things appear and how they actually function. Perception can be misleading and in some cases deliberately shaped. But reality tends to assert itself over time, regardless of the narrative. When countries invest heavily in image management, parades, televised missile launches, aggressive statements on global platforms, it can create the illusion of dominance. But illusions don't win wars. Systems, logistics, adaptability, and discipline do. The United States, for all its visible presence, is often underestimated in its consistency. There are headlines about defense budgets, about controversial interventions, about the politics behind foreign policy decisions. But beneath the noise is an operational depth that's hard to overstate. The actual machinery of power, the data networks, the layered command structures, the readiness protocols, the capacity to execute simultaneous missions on opposite sides of the world, is built over decades. It's not reactive, it's institutional, it doesn't need to be announced, it exists whether cameras are rolling or not. This is the difference between systems built for optics and systems built for function. In many ways, the United States doesn't need to show force constantly because its capabilities are embedded in global infrastructure, a satellite constellation that never sleeps, naval forces that move silently but decisively. Intelligence assets that span continents, these aren't tools for theater. They're assets designed to reduce uncertainty, mitigate threats before they materialize, and, most importantly, give policymakers time and choices in high-stakes environments. On the other hand, Russia has, in recent years, leaned heavily into shaping perception. Whether through state media, strategic timing of military demonstrations, or information warfare tactics, the goal has often been to project strength far beyond what the underlying capacity can support. That's not to say Russia is weak. Far from it. It possesses nuclear capabilities, a legacy military infrastructure, and experienced personnel. But when the actual strength is measured, not just shown, cracks start to appear. Maintenance issues, supply chain fragility, aging technology, and an over-reliance on deterrence over innovation all contribute to a reality that's more constrained than it appears. This gap between perception and reality is important because it affects how both allies and adversaries make decisions. If a nation is perceived as stronger than it really is, it may deter some threats temporarily, but it can also invite overextension. And when reality catches up, credibility is lost. That's a dangerous place to be. It erodes the ability to negotiate from strength and undermines internal confidence. Strategic bluffing, when exposed, can trigger a chain of consequences that are difficult to control. There's also the matter of how societies perceive their own power. In open systems like the U.S., where criticism is constant and transparency is expected, there's often a healthy skepticism toward the idea of unchallenged strength. This can look like internal conflict or division, but it actually reflects a deeper resilience. The ability to question strategy, correct errors, and adapt in real time is one of the most underappreciated forms of strength. It prevents stagnation, it allows for course correction, and it keeps systems accountable. In contrast, a tightly controlled narrative like the one maintained in Russia and suppress necessary feedback. When perception is managed from the top down, it becomes harder to hear the signals that something isn't working. And in complex environments, especially military ones, delayed feedback is costly. A system that doesn't learn fast enough can't pivot effectively. And in modern conflict, speed of learning often determines outcome more than brute force. Another way perception diverges from reality is in how power is measured. The number of tanks, ships, or missiles is still relevant, but increasingly the intangible layers, data processing, artificial intelligence, electronic warfare, real-time logistics, play a larger role in determining advantage. These don't lend themselves to dramatic displays, they aren't easily photographed or paraded, but they quietly shape the reality of conflict, and nations that invest in these capabilities consistently outperform those that rely purely on visible force. This isn't to say perception doesn't matter. It does. Soft power, reputation, influence, these are real currencies. But if perception runs too far ahead of capacity, it becomes a liability. In contrast, when reality is strong, even if it's understated, it becomes a long-term advantage. The ability to deliver, to adapt, and to scale when it counts is what ultimately defines power in the real world. Over time, the illusion fades, and what remains is what actually works. That's where the real difference is. Not in the speeches or the optics, but in the systems that endure when the spotlight moves on. In the end, this isn't a battle between two budgets. It's a contrast between two visions of power, one that relies on scale, science, and sustained investment, and another that operates on shock, spectacle, and short-term gain. The $997 billion isn't just louder, it's deeper, more thoughtful, more future-ready, and in a world where complexity grows by the day, that kind of power, measured, modern, and multidimensional, is not only louder, it lasts longer because real might doesn't just win battles, it shapes peace, it prevents the next war before it starts, and that's the voice we need to listen to.